Welcome back to Season 5 of Decision Points. I'm David Makovsky, the Ziegler Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I'm happy to go on this journey with you. The past academic year has been a very tumultuous one, marked by campus strife over the Israel-Hamas war, with protesters often organizing either encampments or rallies against Israel's actions in Gaza, and in some cases against the state of Israel itself. No less than 3 Ivy League presidents have resigned since the October 7th atrocities, amid the controversy surrounding academia and campus culture and the relationship to the war. Congressional panels have become involved seeking to scrutinize universities' handling of the war. New regulations have been issued by the U.S. Department of Education, and there have been a slew of Title VI lawsuits across the country. For many Jewish students, some of these protests have contributed to an environment of hostility, and according to Hillel International, there has been a 700% increase in total reported antisemitic incidents since October the 7th, compared to the previous academic year. A recent report by the Brandeis University's Cohen Center for Modern Jewish Studies found that the level of hostility towards Israel and anti-Semitism on campus varied greatly across different universities across the country, but certain schools were hotspots for hostility. However, the report found that a majority, 66% of non-Jewish college students showed no animosity towards Jews nor Israel. Yet there remained a stubborn minority of about a third that either opposed Israel's existence or were hostile to Jews, and a few openly admitted to hostility to both. As colleges are reopening their doors this fall, how do we put the Brandeis survey in context? What is it about Israel and the war that is a catalyst for so many students? Is it connected to a set of controversial academic theories or ideas that go beyond the Israel-Palestinian conflict? How do narratives play a role? According to some of these academics, the basis of the protests are tied to these controversial theories, as certain countries in their mind are permanently illegitimate because of the way they were founded. To tackle this complex topic, I had the opportunity to speak with 2 people who could bring a layer of data-driven analysis and nuance to this discussion, Leonard Saxe and Uriel Abulof. We'll first hear from Len and followed up with my conversation with Uriel. Leonard is the director of the Cohen Center for Modern Jewish Studies and the Steinhardt Social Research Institute at Brandeis University, and he's one of the co-authors of the recent Cohen Center report that we will explore today. He's also a professor of contemporary Jewish studies and social policy at Brandeis. Uriel is an associate professor at Tel Aviv University and a visiting professor at Cornell University. His recent books include The Mortality and Morality of Nations and Living on the Edge, The Existential Uncertainty of Zionism, which received the prestigious Israel Bahat Prize. I'm delighted to speak with both of them on this episode of Decision Points. We will begin with Len to unpack the recent study of students across the U.S. and what it means. Professor Len Saxe, welcome to Decision Points.
Delighted to be with you.
It's great to have you. And so let's get a little sense of a lay of the land and really get a sense of the key takeaways of the report on the campuses that you just co-authored. So I want to understand really what was the purpose of the survey and the questions you sought to answer, and to relate the survey to other work you have done earlier in the Gaza war and perhaps before the Gaza war.
October 7, 10/7 last year profoundly affected me. I knew 2 of the people who were murdered on that day, and I was very concerned. I was concerned about Israel. I was concerned about what I could do. And my piece of it, I have been studying young Jews on campuses for almost 25 years. I've been studying the birthright program, but a broader set of issues about young adult Jews. To start with your second question, in the fall, we wanted to understand how Jewish students were being affected by what was going on in Israel. And the bottom line, we did a report in December about the study, was that Jews on campuses were afraid. They were obviously concerned with what was going on in Israel, but their lives had been turned upside down. Some of it was simple concern for people that they knew in Israel, family, friends, connections, but other pieces of it were what was going on campus that made them hide in their dorm rooms, made them take off kippah or put in inside their shirt any symbol that they were Jewish. We had one student who told us she had a very Jewish sounding first name, that she didn't tell people who she didn't already know what her name was for fear that they would identify her as Jewish. Our purpose in doing this study, we did it on 51 campuses, was to try to figure out not only how it was affecting individuals, but could we discern what campuses did to either make Jewish students feel afraid, not afraid, allowed to pursue their education. When we got done and it was clear that something had happened, we had never seen the level, called it anti-Semitism, hostility to Jews, that we documented. But I realized pretty quickly that we couldn't figure out what to do unless we studied the other students, the non-Jewish student population. So that led to the study that we recently reported, which was a study of over 4,000 students at 60 campuses. Again, we want to see if we can identify links between what goes on that campus, from the policies to the demography of the student body, to the faculty and their reactions. And we wanted to look at whether the non-Jewish students in particular had anti-Jewish attitudes, what are called the traditional anti-Semitic tropes, whether they had hostility to Israel. So we constructed a survey that asked them a whole bunch of questions about their attitudes to Jews, their attitudes to Israel, and we picked negative stereotypes. We picked things that we knew from our earlier work Jewish students found particularly offensive and, if you will, underlay their fear about what was going on. We also tested whether or not the students who had anti-Jewish and anti-Israel attitudes had a coherent, I'll call it, narrative of the situation, the so-called settler colonial hypothesis theory idea, or whether it was something about people of privilege. The fancy name in psychology for it is anti-hierarchical aggression, whether they were simple or complex thinkers, dichotomous thinkers or not. So we wanted to look at this. In the survey, there's only a certain amount of real estate. You can only ask a certain number of questions, so we couldn't probe everything that we wanted to ask. But we got a sample of a large group of people, turned out to be very diverse from a religious and from a racial, ethnic basis. And it's a snapshot of what was going on last semester. Now, we started this study in March. We fielded it in late March. We were collecting data through April and into May. So we have data both before the encampments, during the encampments, and afterwards. And our analysis focused on what are the patterns.
Tell me about the findings. What were your main takeaways? What did you learn from this? And then, to the extent you could understand, what is driving these views? How much of it is faculty? How much of it is social science? How much is social media? How much of it is peers? What did you find, and why are they thinking the way they're thinking?
So one of the headlines is that majority of non-Jewish students on this diverse set of campuses, and they were campuses that were places where large numbers of Jewish students go, were not at all hostile. They didn't express any hostility or low levels of hostility to either Jews or to Israel. That was about 2/3 of the group. Now, there was a third where we did see hostile attitudes. It was a tiny group, 2% overall, who had hostility to both Jews and Israel. And again, the hostility to Jews was measured in terms of traditional stereotypes. Jews have too much power. They only care about their own. They talk about the Holocaust to further their political agenda, and Jews should be held accountable for what Israel does. And these people also thought Israel doesn't have a right to exist, that it was is legitimate to target Israeli civilians. It was specific to Hamas, that supporters of Israel control the media, and that they wouldn't be friends with anybody who supported Israel. But that was only 2%. There was another slightly over 30%, and they were divided into two groups, who had either primarily anti-Jewish attitudes and expressed anti-Jewish hostility, or expressed anti-Israel hostility. We go to lengths in our report to say that even a small group of people can cause a great deal of chaos, while one can take comfort in the fact that anti-Jewish stereotypes and attitudes and hostility to Israel is not the majority view of young people on campuses. That doesn't take away from the concern that we have about what the others are doing.
But just so I understand for the listener and for myself, it still might be alarming to people to say of that 31%, say it's about half of each of them are either anti-Israel or anti-Semitic. That still, to many, would sound, that's a lot of people that are anti-Semitic. You would think that a college attracts the most educated part of a population, that such an educated segment of the United States harbors either anti-Semitic or anti-Israel animus is concerning, troubling.
Absolutely concerning, bothering. And I do believe that, as I spent my life as a university professor, we have failed. As academics in general, we have failed, and many of our universities have failed. I want to, however, just pull apart or focus on one bit of what you said. So the anti-Israel hostility that is expressed, one can't say that it is not anti-Semitism. In fact, it is anti-Semitism. It's interesting. I mean, one of the components of this is to deny Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state. Even the most, and I'll call it top-down definition of anti-Semitism, the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism, which is considered the most progressive of the definitions that are out there, it acknowledges, or it uses as an example, that denying the right of Jews to a state is anti-Semitism. In the same way, saying that you wouldn't befriend a person who is Jewish, that's the standard way in sociology that you measure prejudice towards another group. In some ways, it's a way of expressing anti-Semitism in the current environment that may be more socially accepted, and it may be socially unaccepted to express it in purely Jewish religious terms, but it's the same thing.
No, 100%. I'm glad you clarified that. I think this point where anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism overlap, I think we could do a whole podcast episode just on that point alone. And I'm so glad that you brought that out, because when you measured for this, again, half of the approximate 30% of the respondents are anti-Israel. It's not like here are our policy critiques of what Israel did. It goes beyond that. Is that fair to say? It's about agreeing that Israel has a right to exist or to defend itself? Would you say, when you define the word as anti-Israel hostility, how would you define that word?
Well, we defined it in terms of the question. Israel doesn't have a right to exist. One of the interesting things, it's close to 90% of the people in that anti-Israel or Israel hostility group say that supporters of Israel control the media. And so what it means is that even when presumably they hear about something such as the murder this past weekend of 6 of the hostages while negotiations were still going on, they either don't believe that, or they believe that it is simply a public relations effort by the Israeli government. Now, I'm a cognitive social psychologist, if you will, by birth, by training. So I'm interested in how people resolve cognitive dissonance, how they take different ideas and they put it together. So the distrust of the media, the distrust of the information that they're getting about the situation makes them unempathetic, and I believe also not able to understand the full dimension of the conflict.
So, as we zoom in again on this approximate 33% in those categories that you have, how do you think these people are getting their views? How much is coming from their home? How much from their peers? How much from social media? And how much from academics? And again, none of these categories are purely mutually exclusive. I think this is a big question for people. There's been a lot of focus on academia after October the 7th. People want to know, where is this coming from, this hostility, and how much of it did they have before October the 7th?
So, one of the things that I saw recently was Stanford University's Committee on Dealing with Anti-Semitism, a report. And in that report, they use a phrase, it's in the air. And they talked about the very negative things that were happening to Jewish students, the anti-Semitism that existed on the campus. In some ways, all of the things that you listed are probably playing some role. And it may be the cumulative effect of all of these things. They see it on social media. That's where they get lots of their information. They may hear it in a class. They may hear from a friend who was in a class where something is said. They read newspapers. They hear chants if they go to a protest or they see flyers on campus. We think all of these things are going on. It's very hard to separate it out. While I'm critical of the role of faculty, because I think we have not accepted our responsibility to educate students in the full meaning of that, help them understand the world. I don't think that this is a couple of faculty who have a narrow ideological position, the settler colonial view, for example. I think it is much broader than that.
Or the intersectionality argument that injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere, and the world could be divided between the oppressor and the oppressed. How much are those theories creating an intellectual or pseudo-intellectual kind of infrastructure for this kind of discussion and attitudes?
So certainly those people who are hostile to Israel reflect more of these kinds of views. But I don't know what's cause and effect. I don't know if they become part of groups that hold these views, and so then they endorse them to some extent, or that's the driving force. I also think that we have to appreciate, and it's the dissonance resolution issue. People can hear information, if you will, accurate, correct information, but then it gets filtered through what they already believe. And we live in a world right now, and in the United States in particular, in the midst of this bizarre presidential election where the most ridiculous things are thrown out there and different groups believe them or support the person who holds those views, even though it doesn't arise from any coherent sense or agreement with that issue.
So you're saying it's like people could be watching the news, but it's often reinforced and interpreted through the prism maybe of social media or other things with people that have a real twist on things, and that's the way people interpret and process the news they see. I mean, it's some combination.
It's that, but it may be even more benign kinds of things. I remember once being in Israel during one of the conflicts with Gaza where missiles had been sent from Gaza and Israel had responded. I remember watching TV in Israel one night, and I went back and forth between watching probably CNN and watching one of the Israeli channels. And on CNN, the film that kept being played over and over again was of explosions in Gaza from Israeli fighter jets. And the same explosion got repeated over and over again. On the Israeli side, you didn't see explosions in Gaza. You saw charts of how many missiles had been fired to the center of the country, to the south of the country. So kind of a subtle way of giving a different narrative without anybody claiming anything.
100%. Look, in general, this war, as I watch American media and Israeli media in Hebrew, I mean, sometimes it comes across as two completely different wars because the video footage is so different. I want to talk to you also about the Jewish dimension of this, of the Jewish students and how they're processing things. But just because we are talking about where you said, some of us educators, maybe we failed in educating people in the fuller sense of the word. How do you see the role of universities, their administrations? We're now starting a second year of this. Do you think there are lessons learned here that the universities should implement or are implementing? Those aren't the same. How do we learn from year one and what looks to clearly be, whether it's the war's over and we're going to deal with an aftermath that's going to be a while? Now, without naming names, where do you see the universities that are learning lessons and those who aren't?
So, one, and it's a very simple one, is that universities have to be assiduous in applying their codes of conduct in an equal way. You can't say certain that hate speech against one group is not okay, and then hate speech against another group is okay. And I think a lot of universities have learned it. Now, they've learned it because Title VI complaints have been filed against them, and they've been forced by courts, by the Department of Education, to develop plans to respond. But that's a simple piece of it. Campuses need to be places where free speech is respected, where free speech is a fundamental principle, but there are lines that you don't cross. I think too many universities took a laissez-faire, hands-off view of it and allowed conduct, protests against Israel that wouldn't have been allowed on other things. So that's fundamental. I think the second, though, is that we got to figure out better ways to teach citizenship skills. People come out of universities and they don't know how to even interpret the results of surveys. Our media, not just our social media, is filled with surveys of this and surveys of that. Surveys are used sometimes to shape public opinion, to help us understand what's going on in the world. And few people have the ability to understand what's the relationship between the size of the sample or how they were selected and so on. Nate Silver and all of the people that he's worked with and are part of that field have done a lot in recent years to help us. But that's one of these fundamental kind of educational skills of sorting out information that people haven't learned. There are lots of people now questioning the professionalization turn that universities have taken. The purpose of education, and maybe it's not surprising given the cost of education, is to learn a field, a profession, a trade, even if that means having the skills to get admitted to a good graduate school. And some of the broader skills about how do you weigh information, how do you argue, how do you use rational processes to agree and disagree with others, we're not doing a very good job of teaching. And universities need to do that.
Let me ask you then about the Jewish students. You're a student of them. You're like I see as the scholar tracking birthright, which is, for the people who don't know, it's this program of hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Jewish students over the years that have made trips to Israel, supported by philanthropy in this country for the most part, although the Israeli government also is helpful. And how are the people that you've been tracking all these years, how are they processing everything since October 7th? And has it had an impact on their relationship with Israel and their own Jewish identity? You said at the beginning, the first survey that you did, they're afraid. What has happened since the fall?
I want to set the scene, if you will. And if you go back 5 years, the fall of 2019, so that was the fall before COVID hit, you had a fairly substantial proportion of Jewish students on campus who had some direct personal experience in Israel. I don't know if it was 40% of the Jewish students, but it was approaching that if it wasn't 40%. Here we are in 2024. In some ways, the students on campus now, the COVID generation, even those who would have gone to Israel during high school or after their bar bat mitzvah, they didn't have the opportunity to do it. So we have a campus where, relative to 5 years ago, many fewer students have that personal experience. They don't have the ability to reach out to an Israeli peer who most likely is serving now or has served over the year in Zahal in the army and find out kind of directly what's going on. They have a sense of the geography of Israel and so on. So it's a totally different situation. Birthright has cost much more to send people now, or it's very difficult to send people during COVID. So the numbers are down, even though they're still bringing thousands of people. I think those, for the most part, Jewish students are both highly supportive of Israel. It's, I won't say obsess them, that makes it sound like it's a pathological condition. But there are students, especially during the early stages of the war, they couldn't concentrate on other things. They were worried about what was going on.
You would say their identity deepened as a result, and maybe even the hostility on campus, too? I mean, might have had that counter reaction?
Yes, but it's also complicated because people are complicated. The complication is that as profoundly connected as many felt, and in some ways the war made them think more about it, and so it increased their connection. Social psychology, we call it in-group solidarity when you're attacked from the outside. They were concerned with Palestinians, and many of them could distinguish between Hamas, the group that is called for the elimination of Jews in Israel and around the world and the end of the state of Israel, and the Palestinians who live on the West Bank, who are the equivalent of innocent Israelis. We called their views nuanced. Many of them expressed unfavorability with the Israeli government. They didn't support the Netanyahu government, but at the same time, they supported the Israeli people. They had nuanced views. They were afraid both about what was happening to them, but also what they knew was going on in Israel. But I think it's a relatively small group. It produced their own version of hostility to Israel. In the same way that the president, that Bougie Herzog, apologized to the families of the hostages who were killed. John and Rachel Goldberg-Pollen did the same thing. You can have complicated views, but you have these complicated views because you feel connected. If you didn't care, you wouldn't feel so strongly.
You've been also a demographer of American Jewish life, and you're someone who understands that for the American Jewish community, they've seen the campuses as their dreams, as an escalator for the success in American life. They've saved money for their children, their grandchildren. And when they hear about all that's going on campuses, they're very nervous about the future of the academy and the relationship of American Jews. They feel that there are groups out there that want to push them out of it, whether it's in the admissions process, whether it's in terms of academic positions. What would you say to them, as you know them so intimately? How should they be thinking about the campuses at a time of crisis and the future of the relationship of the American Jewish community with these campuses? And a lot of them come up to me and say, what can I do? There's some who say, well, pull money out of the universities, send them to other schools, or they want to somehow organize themselves in a certain way with congressional committees and things like that. What do you say to this community that is, I think parts of it are at a point of high anxiety, I think, after October 7th?
Yes, I think anxiety is a good term to describe the last year, but they're anxious about lots of things. I think it's not just what's going on specifically on campus, it's what's going on politically here and in Israel. The question that I get when I speak, and it comes up right away when I stop, is which campus shouldn't I send my child to, or which campus should I send them to? I said, listen, I would love to have your son, daughter, grandchild come to Brandeis because we're a great place and we were founded by the American Jewish community. But I don't want to go back to the 1950s and the 1940s when there were quotas at universities. And there were some places that Jewish students could go, and there were other places that Jewish students shouldn't go. And I say, join me and let's make all of our universities places that are good for Jewish students, that are good for America. I'm echoing what Louis D. Brandeis said, because I don't think we can isolate ourselves at a couple of universities, whether that's going to be good for us, America, Israel, the world.
Professor Len Saxe, I want to thank you for this wide-ranging conversation. It's a topic on many people's minds these days as we start the new academic year. Thanks for bringing your thoughts, your data, to illuminate a wider picture for us at this time. Thank you very much for joining Decision Points.
Thank you, David.
Something that merits a deeper discussion are the underlying views and narratives that are contributing to and in some ways determining the shape of the discourse on campus. Now, here's my discussion with Professor Uriel Abulof to take a further look about how a few influential academic belief systems may be shaping how students are viewing the conflict. So I'd like to start with some background. And, you've written about many aspects of political science, international relations. You've focused in your writings a lot on nationalism and ethnic conflicts. You're a professor at Tel Aviv University. You're also affiliated, teach at Cornell, and you've been at Princeton. I just want to understand how certain terms are used or misused in the academy today. I want to start with something you wrote shortly after October 7th. As the Israel-Hamas war broke out, you wrote, quote, "The first casualty of war is truth. Truth is killed by words, not bullets, and 4 such words are often fired at Israel: occupation, apartheid, colonialism, and genocide." I'd like you to go through each phase and explain how you think it's used rightly or wrongly when it comes to Israel. And we want to understand the roots of this language and how it's used in academia and conceptualizing Israel, and how much of it is a way to weaponize language by comparing Israel to the old South Africa. Let's start with occupation. Is it legit to call it an occupation?
I think so. And I think it's interesting, the concept of occupation used to be the most prevalent concept used when it comes to Israel's control over the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. But it has fallen out of favor, which I think is a very interesting process. And you can definitely see that with the students' demonstrations, but you can moreover see that with scholarly discourse. There is something called the Middle East Scholar Barometer. And they asked scholars who are experts in both Middle Eastern affairs and political scientists, thousands of those, questions relating also to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And in one of the last surveys, before the war, the scholars were asked to give a name to the situation on the ground. Less than a third considered that an occupation or a semi-permanent occupation, which for me seems to be quite accurate. The majority argued that what we actually witness is a one-state reality akin to apartheid. So this is a far more prevalent now concept, apartheid, rather than occupation, when it comes to try to understand at least the academic conceptualization of the conflict, or the way things are. Now, you ask about the origins of the concept of occupation, and it goes back to over a century ago, to the Hague regulations. And the idea behind occupation is that there is a hostile army that has taken over a territory and its population and has placed it under its authority. Now, I think that this by and large fits what we have seen when it comes to the West Bank and the Gaza Strip from 67, at least until the Oslo Peace Accords. One can arguably say that it is not, and that has been the argument of Israel for many years, basically saying, look, we did not occupy an independent country. There was no independent Palestine to speak of, right? We had the partition plan by the UN, 47, but then following the 47-49 war, those territories were taken by Egypt and Jordan. There was never an independent Arab state, presumably Palestine, in those territories. In the case of Egypt, it was a clear-cut occupation. In the case of Jordan, that was an annexation, but it was only recognized by Iraq and Britain. And in that case, Israel argued, well, it's not really an occupation because it wasn't really an independent state to begin with. most of the international resolution favored to use the concept of occupation. And it makes sense to a certain extent because it seems like more of a technicalities. On the ground, what you have is an army that was considered by the local population overwhelmingly as a hostile army, and it has the authority over it. Now, of course, things get more complicated with the Oslo Accords. It gets more complicated because part of the Oslo Accords, and there was the first phase and the second phase, but ultimately in the West Bank it was such that in the territories designated as A, they came to be under the rule of the Palestinian National Authority. And arguably you could say that in those territories there was no occupation. But since the term relates to sovereignty and Israel continued to hold an overall sovereignty over the West Bank effectively, using the IDF as the machine for that, I think it's relatively fair to say that the occupation in the West Bank lingered. It gets even more complicated when we look at the Gaza Strip, because in 2005 you have the Israeli disengagement from the Gaza Strip.
Where Israel pulled out all the settlers and its military.
Exactly. So what do you do with the Gaza Strip? Obviously there was no, since then up until October 7th, there was no continuous IDF presence in the Gaza Strip. Was it still occupied? I mean, arguably say, because Israel still controlled the airspace and the Sea of Gaza, right? To a certain extent, you can argue that here you actually have elements of occupation, but really it falls short of the pristine definition of occupation. So there is an ongoing legal debate whether or not this fits the bill of an occupation. I think that when it comes to the Gaza Strip, it's problematic. At least it is problematic. Up until October 7, what happened ever since and will happen, who knows? But up until October 7, I think it is somewhat problematic to call it so. Despite everything that I've just said, I would argue that all the different concepts being used in order to designate the situation, I think occupation comes as close as possible. Nothing is entirely pristine or pure in that regard, but occupation comes as close as possible to designate the situation as it is. But as I said, there has been an ongoing trend in scholarly discourse, in academic discourse, and again, by both professors, scholars, and by students, doing away with the concept of occupation and using other concepts instead. Apartheid, colonialism, a genocide, these are three, or open-air prison when it comes to the Gaza Strip. These are some of the more popular academic concepts that we've been seeing increasingly.
Why is it happening? Why are they using these terms?
Occupation is not strong enough. I think there is a very clear element of wanting to harshly, strictly denounce whatever Israel has been doing, and moreover, Israel itself. Occupation doesn't transmit, in terms of the wording itself, the sort of vehement moral objection and emotional resonance of what the scholars are seeking here. So there is, I guess, to a certain extent, a sort of a dissonance going on between the sort of delegitimation that you want to make to what Israel has been doing and the word that has been used so often, occupation. It sounds relatively mild. Speak about apartheid, now that sounds serious. Colonialism, definitely so. Genocide, at most, right? And so if you use those words, it carries more weight. And I think that to a certain extent, we've thrown the more serious academic debate, discourse, under the bus of the moral sense of righteousness. We do that even academically, even in the ivory tower, which I think is unfortunate. And if you go one by one through all of those concepts, I mean, for example, the origins of the concept of apartheid, to what extent it really resonates with the situation, right? The aspects of colonialism, elements of genocide. I mean, look, in all of those words, right? Apartheid, colonialism, genocide, or even the open-air prison when it comes to the Gaza Strip. In all of those concepts, there is an air of truth. There are elements that you can hold on to and say, well, there is actually an analogy that can be used. But if you look at the complexity of the concept in its original setting and the way that it was transposed onto the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and if you try at least as much as possible to neutralize some of those more emotional and moral aspects of it, I think that you can see that those concepts fit the conflict even less than occupation. So I think their usage is not so much intellectual as it is, again, emotional and moral.
As someone, Uriel, who's been devoting my life to this issue, I think that people do need to understand context. Israel pulling out of Gaza in 2005, thinking that it was turning it over to the Palestinian Authority, and then Hamas in 2007 outmaneuvered, outmuscled the PA, and Israel has lived with that ever since. And Israel thought, well, if they're out, then no one's going to fire rockets at Israel. And yet they found out that Hamas would fire anyway, even though they were out. That's when the whole issue of dual use, of embargoes and things like that became. But that is totally lost, because once you use the word open-air prison, people don't know the historical context. Again, I'm not talking about the 16th century, 17th century, 18th century, 19th century, 20th century. I'm talking about the 21st century. But there's no context, and there's a weaponization of language.
I mean, we can say a lot about the open-air prison. I think that context is a very interesting wording to use. It started with Chomsky and Norman Finkelstein. They've been popularizing this term, which is peculiar, especially, at the beginning, the world's largest, as if people have forgotten entirely about North Korea for that matter. But even the use of prison in that context is so fascinating because, it's the sort of prison that you have to imagine where, in fact, the jailers never go to that prison up until the last war, up until October 7th. The jailers are not really present in that prison. They actually allow the prisoners to run the prison. Moreover, they funded the prisoners with about $2 billion in order to arm themselves against the jailer of that prison.
And the jailer does not control what comes in or out. I mean, if it's a prison, at least you would think it has like some sort of hermetic control. But here we've seen all this Iranian weaponry and all this stuff coming in. Some jail, the jailers don't have any control.
But again, there is something and I think that this is the interesting, really even fascinating aspects about using the term. When you learn about the situation in the Gaza Strip, and people do suffer, even before October 7th, but it resonates. The term itself resonates, and it invokes certain emotional appeal.
And you say it's Noam Chomsky, who's known in the United States, was one of the origins of that term.
Norman Finkelstein. And both of them really popularized the term. And again, I think that in both cases, you say weaponizing, and definitely that is the case. But I think that we should ask ourselves, why has it worked? That is important in that regard. The resonance of that is vastly important. The fact that it has resonated emotionally and that we have given precedence to the emotional aspect of the academic language we use over the exactness of it being precise, that's a very important evolution, I think, when it comes to the way that we do academic work in general and the way that we conduct our public discourse in general. It has to do with the post-truth era that we are part of.
Let me then talk about also this term white settler colonialism. And it's ironic. Most of Israeli Jews are Mizrahi, of Middle Eastern origin, not Ashkenazic. And of course, they are Israeli Arabs or Palestinian Israelis, however you want to call them, but still this term of white settler colonialism. Can you give us a definition, and where did this come from? How much of it is this term used regarding the United States, and how much is the U.S. and Israel viewed similarly?
That's interesting. Now, scientifically speaking, settler colonialism is a distinctive term, distinctive from what is typically referred to as imperialism. Right? In imperialism, you have a certain, strong, typically country, state, a kingdom that has been sending certain relatively limited outposts to various regions of the world in order to use and more exactly abuse the sources, whether we're talking about natural resources or human beings, right? Part of the slave trade and all of that. So this is imperialism. You do not settle those areas. With settler colonialism, it wasn't enough to take over, militarily speaking. It wasn't even enough to abuse them economically. You have sent your own people from the hub, typically a European hub, to settle those areas and typically kick out those locals that were there to begin with. And then when you turn that into the Israeli-Palestinian or the Israeli-Arab context, certain questions do emerge. For example, what would be the hub of Zionism in that regard? Presumably, if this is settler colonialism in the late modern evocation of the concept. Okay, so what is exactly the empire? I mean, obviously there wasn't Israel before there was Israel, right? So what is the empire that is sending those Zionists, those evil Zionists, in order to settle on their behalf the land? Presumably the British Empire, I imagine, because you wouldn't really say that about the Ottoman Empire. Of course, Zionism emerged during the time of the Ottoman Empire. So it was the British Empire that sent Zionism in order to settle Palestine on their behalf. It seems like all the chronicles of history that we do have on hand seems to go against that. Not least, of course, the British Empire abundant rejection of Jews immigrating to Palestine, even in the wake of the rise of Nazism in Germany. Did not allow the millions of Jews to immigrate to that Palestine. Well, presumably, if that was settler colonialism on behalf of the British Empire, they would have wanted that. We would not have the ongoing armed struggle between Zionism and the British Empire. And yet we have that. So that is one issue that those using the term are facing. So one way to handle that is basically to extend the concept of the hub that is basically sending those people. Now the hub is not necessarily an empire, but sort of a race, white people. So it doesn't really matter if you are British, if you are American, or otherwise, if you are Zionist coming from Eastern Europe, as long as you are white, as long as we can designate you as white, you belong to that strata of human population who has been colonizing and moreover enslaving other parts of humanity. And in that regard, you can easily fit, most of the Zionists early on did come from Europe. Of course, many others have come from other parts of the world. And of course, you can extend the argument that they made before about colonialism to other concepts. For example, when it comes to slavery, throughout human history, many of the slave owners, many of those who trade slave, did not come from white races. The country that has most benefited Jews in terms of sheer numbers of slaves was Brazil. The Ottoman Empire, as far as I know, usually is not designated as white, has, I think, traded about 2 million as slaves. Some of them, by the way, were white from the Caucasus area. But these elements of complexities do not fit into, in here we can probably use the term, black and white sort of way that many people would like to see reality and would like to see the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And seeing it in such a way to designate Israel as the white colonizer. But those facts, those complexities, those subtleties do not fit into that picture. And so they are typically dismissed, even, and this is the most perhaps deplorable aspect, even in an academic setting.
Do you think the U.S. and Israel are viewed equally in terms of this narrative?
I don't think that to the same extent, at least the way that I've been reading the discourse that you do see in academic circles in North America and elsewhere, not because they approve of the U.S. policies, but in terms of the actual rejection of the very existence of the country. While many of the people who do reject Israel and its policies do reject many of the U.S. policies, they do not make the next move, which is to denounce the very existence of the United States, to say that the U.S. should not exist and should in fact cease to exist, the way that many of them have been saying about Israel. So there is an added aspect to it.
How do you explain that asymmetry there?
That's a huge question, of course. The readily available answer that many has been using in Israel and elsewhere is anti-Semitism, right? Obviously, one thing that distinguishes Israel is that this is a Jewish state, or the state of the Jewish people. So if anti-Semitism does play a significant role into that, it can explain aspects of it. I do accept it. I think that in many ways, anti-Semitism plays into that. But I think the roots of anti-Semitism should, again, be carefully examined. I'm not sure at all that the majority of those who protest against Israel even denounce Israel very harshly, even calling for the very destruction of Israel as a state without necessarily calling for a genocide, right? Calling for a politicide, but not genocide, calling for the eradication of the state of Israel, but not for the annihilation of the Jewish people state. I'm not sure that they are overwhelmingly directed by anti-Semitism. I do think that anti-Semitism play a role here. I think that there are other elements that may explain the distinction of Israel in that regard. One, which is obvious enough, is Israel is a relatively easy target because it's relatively weak. Okay, it's neither the US, it's not also, China or even Russia for that regard. All of those countries are heavily criticized for often enough horrible things that they have done. I mean, if I had to rank all of those, I certainly wouldn't put the US up front as the most horrible of the three superpowers. But certainly the US has its own share of doing bad things. But in all of those three cases, I at least haven't seen any substantial academic discourse calling for the annihilation of China, for the politicide of China or of Russia or of the United States. So one aspect, I think, is really the element of power. I mean, all of those superpowers obviously have killed more people than what Israel has managed to do throughout the chronicles of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, much, much more than that. And of course, if one looks at the history, then the UK and other European powers can easily pivot in that list. They are not. So power, I think, is one element. Israel is just a relatively easy target.
They don't accept the Jews as indigenous to the region, isn't that right? These theories?
In many cases, right? I mean, in order to designate those white Zionist colonizers as truly settler colonialists, the foreign invaders basically to the net, you have to disengage the sort of nativity that you would then proclaim the Palestinians harbor. And again, in this case, never mind the empirical facts that we are well aware of. For example, in the city where I live, in Jerusalem, there has been continuously, throughout the generations, even before the advent of Zionism, a Jewish majority in that city itself. And not in a dominant status by far, right?
Since the 1840s, I believe.
But it's interesting that you dismiss those complexities. And so, in some ways, I guess, to go back to your question, why Israel, or even in some ways, why the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? I think the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has become one of the key casualties in our war against reality, in our war against truth. It may seem odd, and for several obvious reasons. One of the obvious reasons is that nowadays, in our generation, reality, empirical facts, in some ways at least, an attempt to approximate truth, is far more available than ever before, right? We all have it in the top of our fingers. We can just Google it very, very quickly, or we can go to encyclopedia, digital, to authoritative sources of what has been going on. We can do all of that hard work far more easily than ever before. But it is precisely because of that we are witnessing the overwhelming complexity of our world, of the reality that we face. And in this context, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and we've been through that over the past, I don't know how long have we talked so far, but it is so complicated. It is precisely maybe because it is so complicated that you want to fight that complexity.
Let me just bring you to the role of academia on this. And it seems that parts of social sciences and the humanities are fertile ground for this sort of discourse. Some fields more than others. It might be more sociology. It might be less hard sciences. So I'm just trying to understand how academia that is supposed to worship on the altar of complexity, how has academia become that kind of fertile ground? And how much of it is about the conflict itself, or how much of it is about deeper trends in American higher education, the desire to compete with students that are into social media and TikTok and all sorts of things, and looking as a way to grab students into a paradigm that maybe that is readily available. I'm just trying to understand the role of academia, because you would think of all segments of society, academia would push back hardest on anyone that would want to be simplistic.
Absolutely. Ultimately, I do think that it is our role. We are the custodians of, I wouldn't say necessarily truth, but of the pursuit of truth, even if you know that you can never fully grasp it, but the ongoing journey to understand it as much as possible, the truth about the reality of the world, and not just about the real, but also the ideal, and try to chart the ground that leads from one to the other. I think that in a sense, academia and beyond academia for sure, we've been taking a lot of lazy shortcuts. For example, the basic arguments that the strong is wrong. Instead of understanding the complexities of the situation on the ground and the moral implications of them, you take this sort of shortcut. Who is strong? Well, the strong is necessarily wrong. And then you have a sort of a very simple moral way to judge who is right and who is wrong. Now, you mentioned before, and I think this is fascinating, the role of various academic disciplines maybe or approaches, and I think it taps into that. It taps into that because in some ways, perhaps in this generation, what we have seen is the advent of sociology. We have all been training ourselves, not all of us, but many of us have been training ourselves to think sociologically over the past generation. Everything is attached to identity. We see ourselves through the lenses of identity. And of course, intersectionality is part of that, right? The whole is bigger than the sum of its parts, but in a peculiar way that mounts the status of victimhood. And so you have what often is referred to, as the oppression Olympics, etc. The idea being that you cannot really just see the individual before you. What you see before you is a signifier of an identity.
Let me just ask you this. I realize this is a huge question and we could have like 5 episodes on this one question is, how do you grapple with academia? One provost said to me quietly, David, he goes, I can't say this publicly, but we in the academy are stuck across this country in social science with a failed theory of intersectionality. And we don't know how to extricate ourselves. And of course, he noted, in academia, there are people, everyone has tenure, so you can't really start over in a certain regard. And as you point out, the issue of identity politics is exacerbating this issue. And there are a lot of people that are very worried about the future of academia in the United States and around the world. Is there anything you could say to those people? You could say, look, fads go through different cycles and we're in the cycle. Or do you think there's a way to right the ship, as we say, to correct this imbalance and to improve the situation? Because it just seems that things are very stuck. Needless to say, apart from the Arabs and Israelis themselves, you worry about students. I teach graduate students for 24 years, and you want to be sure that they have an accurate understanding of what's going on in the Middle East. And that, to me, always means more complexity, more shades of gray, and then let the students make up their mind. But to put it all on a bumper sticker, he's the oppressor, she's the oppressed, or however it is, doesn't seem like we're really helping the students navigate the complexities of these issues. And so we're not helping in this regard unless we try to right the ship, so to speak. And so how do you think it could happen?
I may be naive about that. I prefer to think of myself as hopeful rather than naive in that regard. But I think it can be better. And I am hopeful about the possibility of things getting better. Partly because, I'm engaging with those students, both in Israel and in the US. And I have a sense that the curiosity is still there. I think that we have to better understand the sort of pressures that this generation is under. We can denounce various aspects of this generation, so to speak, whether it's Y or Z or whatever sort of letter we'll attach to it. But we have to also understand the pressure that they are under. 2008, that moment when you have smartphones and very soon after that, social media. 2008, when you also have the economic crisis. So many of this generation are tremendously worried, yes, about what awaits them in the future, economically, socially, but also in terms of their imagery, which is in some insidious ways more important to them than perhaps any other generation of humanity. And we have to try to understand what that means. There's always that ominous sort of warning, the internet remembers. Everything that you do now will be remembered in the future. There will be payback. And so in that air of terror, it makes sense that they would opt for what most people, or what sort of seems to be like the fashion going on, that they will opt for that. And they will, virtue signaling whatever they feel is right. And it doesn't even have to do with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The issue is that by not allowing them to make mistakes, but not encouraging an academic, I'm talking now about the academic setting, but by not encouraging an environment where mistakes not just tolerated and not even just accepted, but encouraged. This, I think, is the main task for us when we face our students. We have to try and help them turn our world in general, but also that little space of intellectual haven from a battleground to a playground. A possibility for them to play around with ideas, not just identities. Identities is fine, okay, play around with that as well. But play around with ideas, with possibilities, especially the possibility that you are wrong and that you can change your mind a week later and it's okay. Moreover, it's good because this is the stage in your late teens, the early 20s, 30s, whatever, that the things are bubbling up, right? You're trying to make sense of yourself, of who you are, of what you want to become in the future. You want to chart a certain horizon. I think the curiosity is there in terms of understanding what is, what ought to be, constructing the sort of factual and moral compass. When I speak with students, I try at least to cultivate that aspect. I think that the yearning is there. There is the craving to find some ways in order to channel that curiosity. And so I think that we do have a chance in the academia far more than perhaps in any other setting to really allow that to happen. But for that, we have to change element in our academic culture, where we do not punish for mistakes, but cherish them and allow new ways, experimental way to experience the world and the intellectual life within us. And the two are entwined, right? The intellectual parts and the experiential part.
On that hopeful note, issuing a clarion call for complexity, I want to thank you very much, Professor Uriel Abulof, for your time and thoughts. Thank you very much for joining Decision Points.
Thank you, David. It's been a pleasure.
We began our episode with a very interesting conversation with Len Saxe at Brandeis to talk about a study that he co-authored where he found across the country that 2/3 of non-Jewish students do not harbor hostility neither towards Israel nor towards Jews. Yet there remains a remaining third at different levels that do have a problem with this. Now, ideally, the campus environment should be a place to foster a discussion on complexity and nuance, to really drill down and understand why this conflict has been so complicated. Sadly, however, many campuses, not all, of course, have oversimplified the problem, in perhaps a desire to link this to controversial academic theories that are out there. The hope is that going forward that the universities will do their job, which is getting students to explore complexity, have these conversations, talk out their problems. The campus should be a place for cooperation, consultation, and dialogue, and not just for confrontation. Thank you to all of our listeners for joining us on another episode of Decision Points. Thank you to my dedicated team of research assistants at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I want to thank Rena Gabber, Simone Seid-Mayer, Sydney Hillbush, and Gabriel Epstein. I also want to thank Rob, Hadia, and the production team at Podville Media, and listeners like you for making this podcast possible. Please leave us a 5-star review so we can continue to grow this community. Subscribe to Decision Points on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Acast, or wherever you get your podcasts. To our listeners from all over the world, thank you for listening to this season of Decision Points.